You're listening to an Airwave Media Podcast.
Hi everyone, and welcome to part 2 of the story of the Ding Dong Daddy. Now, if you haven't listened to part 1 yet, I do encourage you to listen to that first, although it's not necessary to listen to the second part. The two stories kind of stand independently from one another. They just involve the same man. So what I'll do is give a quick refresher of what happened in part 1. Back in 1915, a man wandered into Kenosha, Wisconsin, claiming to have lost his memory, and he identified himself as John F. Kennedy. No, not that John F. Kennedy. Anyway, with the help of Kenosha police and community, numerous leads emerged as to who the man really was. There were suggestions he was various missing individuals, and that included a miner who may have lost his memory in a mining disaster. Despite multiple attempts to jog his memory, including a chiropractor's intervention, it was eventually revealed that his true name was Francis Van Wie, and he did not have amnesia. It was all a fake. Well, Frank's past quickly came to light as he was confronted by his sister and wife Clara, who accused him of desertion and deceit. His sister Luella further condemned him for his actions, detailing how he had neglected their family and engaged in dishonest behavior. Then after being exposed, Frank returned to Chicago only to be arrested later on charges of abandonment and bigamy, as he had never divorced his first wife. Now, I ended that first part with Frank being discharged from the U.S. Army in 1917 in San Francisco. But that wasn't the last time this guy made headlines. He would once again be front page news in 1945, and that's where he would earn the moniker of the Ding Dong Daddy. I am Steve Silverman, and this is the Useless Information Podcast.
Useless information.
Between being discharged from the Army in 1917 and 1945, when Frank Van Wie returned to front page headlines, there was little mention of what he was up to. Basically, there'd be no more than a sentence here or a sentence there, and they were the kind of mentions a few people would ever take notice of, at least until years later. But there were two notable exceptions that should be discussed, and both occurred within 5 months of one another. The first was on Monday, August 7th of 1922, and that's when a reunion took place between 36-year-old Frank and his 17-year-old daughter Mabel, who he had not seen for 15 years. So basically she was 2 years old the last time he saw her. Now Mabel, whose name will come up later in the story, she was the daughter from his first marriage to Lizzie Kexel, the one that he didn't divorce, that it got him in trouble for bigamy. It was reported that while Frank was away during World War I, Lizzie had obtained that divorce and moved out of her Chicago home, and that's why he couldn't find them. Anyway, upon Frank's return from the war, he wanted to find them, so he took out an ad in the local newspaper. It was a guy named Harry Anderson who was a boarder in a Milwaukee rooming house. He saw the ad, and that triggered their reunion. And not long after that, Mabel moved in with Frank. Now we get to that second mention in the press, and that's because finding Mabel would bring unwanted attention to Van Wie. On January 30th of 1923, Frank was arrested in Milwaukee for abandoning his third wife, Anna Weinstein Van Wie. And this is what really makes it interesting. While abandonment was the reason for him being taken into custody, Frank had a more serious problem facing him. That was prior to marrying Anna. He had never bothered to divorce his first 2 wives. He was now married to 3 women at the same exact time. So here's Frank discussing how he ended up in this mess.
First, there was Elizabeth Kexel of Jefferson. She's the mother of Mabel. Then came Clara Hayes of 579 18th Avenue in 1912. Last came a widow, Mrs. Anna Weinstein. We were married October 20th, 1920.
Little side note here, and this really has no impact on the story, is that a quick check of ancestry shows he was off by 2 days. The two were married on October 18th of 1920, not October 20th. Anyway, he continued.
It was simply a case of separation after each marriage. I never seemed to connect just right.
What Frank did through the rest of the 1920s, the entirety of the 1930s, and the early 1940s, well, that's all largely a mystery. And yes, as I said, occasionally the newspapers would offer a brief mention, a sentence here, a sentence there, but there was nothing significant enough to draw attention. However, some details of his life during these years can be pieced together from the reports published after he reemerged in the headlines starting in 1945. Frank claimed his education ended at the age of 12. In the years that followed, he worked a variety of jobs. As a teamster, that was until he was caught embezzling funds, as a painter, a roofer, supposedly 14 years with the Barnum and Bailey Circus, where he claimed to be a lion tamer. Personally, I think that's a bit of an exaggeration. He shoveled coal for the WPA, the Works Progress Administration. Basically, he just bounced from job to job to job. But the one job he'd forever be associated with was the one he took in 1941. With the majority of the able men off at war and Van Wie way too old to be drafted, he was hired to be a conductor on San Francisco's streetcars. Now, conductors, they worked the back platform of the car. They didn't steer it. That was the motormen who piloted up front. So what did Frank do? Well, it was his job to collect the fares, punch transfers, and ensure passenger safety. His salary was reported to be $43.20 per week, which is roughly $900 per week today. But what Frank liked most about this job was his ability to socialize with people, in particular the ladies. He really liked the ladies, and that's what got him in trouble. It all came crashing down on Van Wie during the third week of January in 1945. You see, that's when Evelyn, his most recent wife, and another woman named Mary Josephine, they compared notes and realized, get this, they were married to the same man at the same exact time. So what did they do? They both hired the same lawyer and they filed to have their marriages annulled. According to their allegations, Van Wie enjoyed a hearty Christmas feast of chicken with Mary Josephine, who he had married on April 8th of 1944. Then, after a warm goodbye and an affectionate pat, he left with an armload of gifts. His destination? Well, a second Christmas dinner. This time it was turkey with his other wife Evelyn, who he had just married days before on December 12th of 1944. His plan, well, it may have worked perfectly if Van Wie hadn't written thank you notes to both women. Unfortunately for him, the notes got mixed up and each wife received the card meant for the other, and that sparked suspicion. The women quickly connected, compared stories, and headed straight to the police to file bigamy complaints. Here's Mary Josephine.
I cooked him a chicken dinner. He ate, kissed me goodbye, and dashed out.
And as we now know, he dashed straight over to Evelyn's, polished off another meal, and exchanged gifts. His perfect crime? Well, he made one fatal mistake. Of course, misplaced cards. Of course, the story made the local papers, and as a result of the publicity, on Sunday, January 21st of 1945, another wife materialized. She was 52-year-old Myrtle Martha Wheeler Van Wie, who Frank had married on September 24th of 1943. Not only was he married to all three women simultaneously, but he had wed all of them within 15 months of one another. Now, Myrtle was initially thought to have been Frank's fifth wife, which meant that Mary Josephine was number 6 and Evelyn was number 7. But further investigation would prove that to be incorrect. Remember earlier when I said that Frank had made the news with a sentence here and a sentence there? Well, they were nearly all marriage listings. The police soon rounded up additional Mrs. Van Wie's, discovering that 4 of them lived within a 12-block area of San Francisco. Do you want to venture a guess as to who was the conductor of the trolley line that serviced that area? Could it be Frank Van Wie? And just what did Frank do after all these marriages were discovered? Well, he quit his job as a streetcar conductor and fled to Los Angeles, where he found work in a paint factory. But his freedom was short-lived, and that's because a security guard recognized him from a photograph and reported him to the police. So on Sunday, January 28th of 1945, that's about a week after his third marriage was uncovered, he was seen strolling into a church smiling, and this will probably come as no surprise, he had a brand new woman on his arm. After his arrest, police found a will dated September 11th, 1944 in his pocket. Now, the document disinherited his two sisters and brother, which should come as no surprise if you listen to the first story, and he left everything to Bretonia Crenshaw, which was the real name of his most recent wife, Evelyn. Now, you'd think he'd be madly in love with her, but he simply described her as, quote, my dear friend, unquote. Curiously, the will was written 3 months before he married her, which is just a few months after he had married his previous wife. The investigation took a strange turn when they learned that another wife, Mabel Joyce, who Frank had married in 1924, was also his legal daughter. Yes, that's the Mabel that he was reunited with in 1922. She listed her address as the Clyde Beatty Russell Brothers Sideshow, Portland, Oregon. Supposedly, Van Wie had come to California with Mabel in 1932, where he worked shoveling coal. Then, in April 1939, Van Wie was charged with abandoning Mabel and was let off with 6 months probation. Well, now that he was in custody, investigators began to piece together Frank's story. But the problem was that Frank was having a difficult time remembering all of the women that he had married.
Don't you remember Louise Weller as one of your wives?
Nope, can't seem to recall her.
Oddly enough, he had married Louise just a year earlier in Sacramento. Now, Van Wie did reveal something new to the investigators, something they didn't know about before, and that was his first marriage to Lizzie, Mabel's mom. Now, I don't know if you're keeping score here, but the total number of wives is now 10. But when pressed for details, Frank admitted that he couldn't remember them all.
I can only recall 6 of them, but there may have been more. I just can't remember.
Finally, Frank just shrugged and said,
I'm guilty, gentlemen, so what's the use of talking?
But the round of questioning continued.
Why did you marry so many women?
I just wanted a home, always wanted a home and contentment.
What was the matter with your wives that made you leave them?
There are ladies here, and I wouldn't want to speak my mind on the subject.
When asked who his favorite wife was, Frank didn't hesitate for a second.
Without a doubt, it was Evelyn. She's the sweetest woman in the world. I was so ashamed of myself when one of my wives filed suit for divorce, and I feared this might come out that I just ran away from her.
Of course, it should be noted that Evelyn was his favorite because she was his most recent wife. Anyway, the press reported that his blue eyes were watery behind his steel-rimmed glasses, and they betrayed a glimmer of regret. Frank was also interviewed by Norma Barsman of the San Francisco Examiner. He made the bold claim that,
You're a woman. I could get you to marry me in a month.
But Norma had the power of the pen, and she wrote the following about, quote, we Frankie Van Wie, unquote.
I was shocked. The man who said this was far on the wrong side of 50, round as a beer barrel, pale and meek-looking, with a shiny bald head and eyeglasses.
Curious as to how Frank could get her to leave her husband and marry him within a month, she asked,
How?
Women want a home and security. They want to be told they're loved more than anything else, and they want their own way. When I met a woman I thought was at all possible, I courted her. I give them all presents, little trinkets to show I thought about them, candies and flowers, I take them to nice restaurants and shows and spend all my money on them. It's simple. If I wanted to get you to marry me, I'd help you cook dinner some night, and I'd make you feel how cozy and secure a home can be. Older women are the ones who particularly like to feel secure. They want to feel like they're building a home and just starting out like a 16-year-old bride.
But Mr. Van Wie, you'd have to do a lot more than help me cook a dinner to convince me I should marry you.
Well, I guess it's my manner that helped me. Besides, I never criticize a woman. I don't try to make her over, at least when I'm courting her. I take her at face value, and I do what she wants. I do anything they want except, well, I won't dance. I think if I had been willing to dance, I could have made friends with more women.
Frank may have charmed his way into the lives of these women, but they generally agreed that he was a terrible husband. Most claimed that within weeks of marriage, his sweet demeanor, it just soured. He became abusive, stayed out all night, and he disappeared for weeks on end. One of his wives summed it up this way.
Frank's a card in the parlor, a gentleman on the street, and a beast in the home.
Another said that within 2 months of their marriage, Frank grew insanely jealous and accused her of seeing other men. As a result, she left him immediately. As already mentioned, Frank was not exactly a tall, dark, and handsome man. In fact, he was the complete opposite. The San Francisco Examiner published a photo of him on January 31st, 1945, being measured next to a younger, taller woman. And this was clearly done mocking the stats of beauty pageant contestants that appeared in the press, and they had arrows pointing to the various parts of Frank's body with the corresponding measurements printed nearby. You ready? Here we go. Frank's height was 5 feet 2 inches or 157 centimeters tall. His shoulders were 18 inches across, that's about 46 centimeters. His chest measured 41 inches and it expanded to 43, which is 104 expanding to 109 centimeters. His arms or biceps were 16 inches or 41 centimeters. He had a slim waist of 40 inches or 102 centimeters. As for his hips, they measured 46 inches or 117 centimeters. His calves were 25 inches or 64 centimeters, and his weight was 180 pounds or 81.6 kilograms. Ladies, I know exactly what you're thinking. What a hunk of a man. Well, despite having his unimpressive stature, Frank clearly had an undeniable talent for persuasion. At least that was until his charm ran out. Needless to say, Frank Van Wie earned a slew of colorful nicknames in the press. They included Casanova of the Car Lines, Streetcar Casanova, the Pinup Man, the Car Barn Casanova, Romeo of the Car Line, and the Trolley Romeo. However, it was Stanton Delaplane, a San Francisco Chronicle columnist, who coined the moniker that stuck. It was the ding-dong daddy of the D-Car line. And that nickname was inspired by the song I'm a Ding-Dong Daddy from Dumas, which was written by bandleader and songwriter Phil Baxter. Ironically, Van Wie never worked on the D-Line. Research suggests he was likely assigned to the Turk and Fillmore division of the Market Street Railway, which was located about 20 blocks away from the D-Line. Delaplane later explained,
I added the D-Car because it was alliterative.
On January 29, 1945, Van Wie was arraigned and pleaded not guilty. His bail was initially set at $2,500, but then reduced to $1,000 in cash. That's equivalent to nearly $17,500 today. His attorneys were Associate Defense Attorney Jake Ehrlich and Defense Attorney James Toner, while San Francisco District Attorney Edmund G. Pat Brown, yes, the future governor of California, he led the prosecution. Ehrlich scrambled to secure bail, saying,
5 bail bond brokers have agreed to chip in $200 each. Purely out of sympathy for the little man, you understand. They have been smitten by his plight.
But just as Ehrlich was pulling the Ding Dong Daddy Defense Fund together, bail bond broker Ed Maloney walked in with the full $1,000 and Van Wie was released. Meanwhile, in one corner of the courtroom, Van Wie's 3 most recent wives, that's Myrtle, Mary, Josephine, and Evelyn, chatted quietly. They remarked how Van Wie's name rhymed with "wee," and Mary Josephine joked that Frank must have been purchasing the wedding rings in wholesale lots. That's when Evelyn remarked,
You girls are lucky you still have yours. Mine was bought on an installment plan and a man came and took it when the payments hadn't been kept up.
District Attorney Brown then turned and addressed his remarks toward the ladies.
Mrs. Van Wie, and the other 2 Mrs. Van Wies, you have my assurance that this case will be prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, and the penalty for bigamy is 1 to 10 years.
Once released on bond, Toner and Ehrlich whisked Van Wie off to the Padre Hotel at 241 Jones Street in San Francisco. They settled him into room 707, which was a cozy room with twin beds. While staying at the hotel, a fast-talking visitor came in offering an unspecified sum of money if Van Wie would endorse a brand of pills. Now, they never said what these pills were, only describing them as, quote, the the kind that collegiates keep awake on when cramming for an exam, and the kind that a man of many wives presumably might take if he had to check in with all of his wives nightly." Unquote. Then, moments later, another promoter followed. This one offered $50, which is about $870 today, offered $50 a night with a 4-week guarantee for a 10-minute nightly appearance on the nightclub circuit. Well, Van Wie decided to sneak away, and he ended up in the hotel bar. That's when a beer truck driver spotted him and casually walked up to the jukebox, dropped in a nickel, and cranked the volume to full blast. Out roared the most appropriate song for the situation. It was Judy Garland's The Trolley Song. And if you don't recall that one, it's from the 1944 movie Meet Me in St. Louis, and it had that very, very famous line, "Clang, clang, clang went the trolley, ding, ding, ding went the bell." I'm going to spare you my singing there. Well, awaiting trial, Van Wie's defense strategy began to take shape. Attorneys Toner and Ehrlich argued that Frank was not a bigamist with intent to defraud, but rather a man suffering from a psychological disorder. District Attorney Brown, however, dismissed that idea.
Marriage is a mighty serious institution. We feel that this is no different from any other case of bigamy, and we do not intend to treat it differently.
On February 3, 1945, Municipal Judge Leo Cunningham raised Van Wie's bail from $1,000 to $3,000, an amount that he was unable to pay, and that landed him back in city prison. The judge justified the increase, remarking that Van Wie
has been all over San Francisco, everywhere except the possible exception of the psychopathic ward at San Francisco Hospital. When a man flouts the marriage contract and treats it so lightly, he is attacking a very serious institution, the home. There has been concern expressed that some of our sounder-thinking, more intelligent citizens are resentful of the buffoonery involved in this case.
He then turned his attention toward the 3 wives.
You ladies were once in love with this man. You now have little of the feeling of friendliness. You have been injured. He has flaunted the specific law which prohibits bigamous marriages.
Well, the following day, Ehrlich announced he was withdrawing from the case. That's because the influential San Franciscans who had funded Van Wie's defense fund, which was known as the Ding Dong Daddy Defense Fund, they had disbanded, and that left Van Wie without their support. By February 5th of 1945, Brown announced that he had launched a deeper investigation into Van Wie's past, focusing on several key allegations. The first is a report that Van Wie had abandoned one of his wives, leaving her with a child that she was forced to put up for adoption. Second, there were allegations that as a union secretary, he misappropriated funds while moving between cities. According to Brown, Van Wie claimed that he repaid the money. As a little side note, I did find the story on that embezzlement, and whether or not he paid the money back, I'm not sure, but I do know that he was still on probation when he joined the Army during World War I, and I think that's how he got out of that. Third was his admission that at age 14 he had served a year in reform school for stealing a horse, and that is definitely true. And finally, allegation number 4 was a disturbing claim that Mabel Joyce, that was Van Wie's 5th wife, was actually his daughter from his first marriage, and we discussed that before. Now, I should add that many believe that Mabel was his stepdaughter, not his biological daughter, although at this point no one has been able to prove that either way. And here's what Brown had to say about those allegations, and it's a little bit redundant because I've already explained a couple of these.
He admitted serving a year in reform school back in Wisconsin on the horse theft charge. And he said that when he was picked up for the alleged embezzlement of the union funds that he was also held in connection with the marriage to his daughter. Apparently, he was released on both counts.
Well, if Frank Van Wie wasn't in enough trouble, that same day U.S. Attorney Frank Hennessy addressed another potential charge against him. That was impersonation of a federal official.
Whether or not we prosecute him for impersonation is still a matter that is in abeyance pending the outcome of his bigamy charges.
The reason the FBI had begun investigating him was because several of Van Wie's wives, they revealed that he had posed as an undercover agent, and that was to justify his prolonged absence from home. Attorney Toner, however, dismissed the accusation, insisting there was no criminal intent.
It was only an alibi, just as some men might say they had to stay out at night because of a lodge meeting.
On February 13th, 1945, that's say about 3 weeks after the story first broke in the news, Frank Van Wie entered dual pleas of not guilty and not guilty by reason of insanity to each of the 3 bigamy charges against him. The case was overseen by Superior Judge Herbert C. Kaufman, and he ordered an evaluation of Van Wie's mental state prior to trial. Now, the trial was set for March 5th, but it was delayed slightly. Anyway, his sanity was assessed by 3 psychiatrists at the psychopathic ward at San Francisco Hospital. Now, I know you're going to find this shocking. The list of his known marriages, it continued to grow. Investigators had now uncovered a total of 14 possible marriages, and 12 of them were confirmed. So I'm going to list them in order, the 12 that were known. Of course, we know Lizzie was the first. Clara played a big part in the first story about Van Wie. Then we had Adeline, Martha, the daughter or possible daughter Mabel, Sadie, Ruth, Juliana, Myrtle, Louise, Mary Josephine, and finally his most recent wife, Evelyn. Wow. Now, I mentioned that Van Wie's trial was delayed slightly. It wasn't a lot. His trial began on March 20th of 1945 with a jury composed of 3 women and 9 men. 4 of his wives did appear in court, and he was still legally wed to all of them, and each one took the stand to testify about how they had met and married him. It was his 4th wife, or the 4th wife there, who was really wife number 7, that was Sadie Levin, who was the final witness of the day. She recounted meeting Van Wie while they were both working for the WPA. Remember, he shoveled coal for them. The couple married in 1941, but separated a year later when he claimed he had been assigned to an army camp for, quote, investigation, unquote, work. Sadie testified that when she informed Frank of her pregnancy, Van Wie accused her of infidelity, claiming,
"You must have had an affair with somebody. I'm sterile."
In typical Frank Van Wie fashion, he abandoned her. He ignored her telegrams and pleas for financial support. Then, months later, shortly before the baby's birth, he unexpectedly showed up at her Page Street boarding house dressed in a U.S. Army uniform. Sadie did note in court that she couldn't tell whether it was the uniform of an officer or that of an enlisted man. Frank explained his long absence by saying he had just returned from a secret mission investigating the Pearl Harbor attack. Likely story. Anyway, he forced her to give birth in a charity ward and placed the baby up for adoption when it was just 10 days old. Then, the next morning, he left once again, claiming that he was needed at Camp Roberts. So she sent him letters there, but they were all returned, party unknown. That Thursday, the jury found Van Wie guilty on all 3 counts of bigamy. It only took them 10 minutes to deliberate the case. He faced a sentence of up to 30 years in prison and $15,000 in fines. That's 10 years and a maximum of $5,000, which is $87,000 today for each count. And since Van Wie had entered a dual plea of not guilty and not guilty by reason of insanity, a second trial was needed to assess his sanity. Well, that trial began just 5 days later. Attorney Toner questioned Van Wie about his criminal history, and Van Wie admitted to the crimes that District Attorney Brown had previously launched his investigation into. Then, after all that was done, Van Wie offered up a detailed account of his 12 known marriages, and he struggled to recall the names of many of his wives and the dates of their unions. When asked if he had been divorced, he believed that he had been divorced once.
"But I don't know when or where."
Judge Kaufman interjected.
"Didn't you realize you were committing a crime, marrying without being divorced?"
"No, sir. I don't think I hurt anyone. I don't see where I committed a crime."
On April 3rd, 1945, after 55 minutes of deliberation, a jury of 9 men and 3 women, yes, it was the same jury from his previous trial, they determined that Van Wie was sane. They had rejected his plea of not guilty by reason of insanity. 2 days later, Superior Judge Herbert C. Kaufman sentenced Van Wie to 1 to 10 years for each of the 3 bigamy counts, with the terms to run consecutively rather than concurrently. What this meant was that Van Wie would have to serve at least 3 years before becoming eligible for parole. In delivering the sentence, Judge Kaufman declared,
"Our civilization, our government, and our homes are founded upon the sanctity of marriage and the preservation of the institution of marriage. Plural bigamous marriages are condemned by all modern societies and by our law, and are destructive of the home and good morals. Bigamy, such as involved in this case, is a most serious crime and does not warrant probation."
Since the state penal code required both imprisonment and a fine for bigamy, the judge imposed a symbolic fine of $1 for each count.
To keep the record straight.
But since Van Wie was flat broke, Judge Kaufman reached into his pocket and generously paid the $3. That's around $52 today. Frank Van Wie, prisoner number 1427, entered San Quentin Prison on April 12th of 1945, which just happened to be, coincidentally, the same day that President Franklin D. Roosevelt passed away. Then on March 18th of 1946, which is about 1 year after the trial began, Judge Kaufman recommended to the State Adult Probation Authority that Van Wie be given the minimum sentence for his numerous marital offenses.
Van Wie is an elderly man, and his case has served to teach a great moral lesson to our youth. Added imprisonment would accomplish no further public good, and the minimum term, in my opinion, would be sufficient to accomplish reformation of the defendant.
On April 11th of 1947, after serving 2 years in prison, Van Wie was released. It was reported that during his time at San Quentin, he worked as a trustee in the prison library. His attorney, James Toner, noted that he believed that all of Van Wie's former wives had either annulled their marriages or obtained divorces. In other words, he wasn't just free of prison, he was free of women. But as a condition of his parole, Van Wie was forbidden from marrying for 5 years without his parole officer's approval. Having lost his job as a trolley conductor, Van Wie gained employment as a peach picker, but ultimately found a more stable job as a janitor in Oakland for $68 per week. That's about $950 per week today. Frank managed to stay out of the news for more than 2 years before reappearing in late 1949. What he wanted to do was marry one more time, but needed Judge Kaufman's permission to do so. Stunned, Judge Kaufman's first step was to confirm that Van Wie really had cleared all his previous marriages through those annulments and divorces. Once he was satisfied with that, he insisted that Van Wie bring his fiancée to court so he could have a very, very serious conversation with her. So on September 16th of 1949, 49-year-old Mary Abba, an Oakland chambermaid, met privately with the judge. She assured him that she was fully aware of the 63-year-old Van Wie's notorious past and was confident that things would be different this time.
I know all about his history and I'm satisfied. He's explained everything very carefully.
Now, this is going to be her second marriage, and despite Judge Kaufman's warnings, Mary insisted on going through with it.
One thing about him, he works hard to provide.
Well, reluctantly, the judge lifted the court's ban on Van Wie's future marriages, and that allowed this marriage to go through. The couple exchanged vows right there in Judge Kaufman's chambers as news photographers snapped pictures. The ceremony nearly stalled when Van Wie couldn't produce a ring, but luckily a helpful photographer loaned him his gold band and the ceremony was able to be completed. Then a reporter questioned Van Wie.
How many weddings does this make?
To be honest, I don't rightly know. I think this is the 14th or maybe the 20th.
At the very end of the ceremony, Judge Kaufman declined Van Wie's offer to reimburse the $3 in fines that the judge had paid for him back in 1945.
Consider that a wedding present.
Frank then declared confidently,
"This is the real thing and it's gonna be my last one."
To which the judge beamed.
This is the happy ending.
An advertisement in the October 1st, 1949 edition of the Oakland Post-Inquirer on page 2 read, quote, Grand wedding party for Francis Van Wie, the ding-dong daddy of the cable cars, and his bride. Tomorrow night, Sunday, 7 to 9 p.m. Gigantic wedding cake. A piece of wedding cake for everybody. All his friends and the public are invited. Newsreel cameras, television, Maycheck's Waffle Shop, 22nd and Telegraph, TW3-9775. And why were they celebrating there? Well, the waffle shop was Frank's place of employment. I'd like to say that they lived happily ever after, but just after 3 weeks of marriage, Mary returned to Judge Kaufman's courtroom with her tale of woe. It was a situation she couldn't quite sink her teeth into, literally, and that's because she no longer had them. At her husband's urging, she had 6 teeth pulled after their marriage, leaving her in considerable pain and not quite her usual self. Her discomfort led to tension, with Van Wie calling her, quote, cold and unloving, unquote, and swearing at her. Mary told the judge that her husband, now proudly known as the, quote, the beaming pop of the waffle shop, unquote, had let his newfound fame go to his head. She felt that having his name in the papers made him a big shot, and to make matters worse, visitors to the waffle shop had started offering him drinks, far too many of them in her opinion. Money became another point of contention. She complained that Van Wie gave her only $2 a day to manage household expenses. That's around $26 per day today. And that he frequently criticized the meals that she prepared for him. Judge Kaufman reminded her that he couldn't take legal action as he had lifted Van Wie's probation restrictions as a wedding gift. But he was concerned, so he agreed to call Van Wie to get his side of the story, but he wasn't home. So for now, the judge advised Mary to take a week off, stay with a friend, and then return to see if they could work things out. Judge Kaufman did eventually talk with Frank and warned him that his latest marriage was on the verge of collapse. Van Wie said the trouble started with that wedding thrown for him at the shop the previous Sunday. He admitted to having a few drinks and then added,
"But I really love that girl. Maybe her gums are just hurting."
Judge Kaufman told the press.
I talked to him last night. He has promised to let her be the boss of the household.
Van Wie also agreed to give his wife more money for household expenses and to check in with the judge weekly by phone. But not long after that, employees at the shop said Van Wie had opted to take a few days off in an effort to reconcile with his wife. Bliss was briefly restored, but the truce wouldn't last. On February 21st, 1950, after about 5 months of marriage, Mary tearfully told Judge Kaufman she was planning to file for divorce.
Our love nest is over and I'm moving out.
She explained that their troubles had worsened after both of them had lost their jobs.
2 months ago, he lost his job. Recently, I lost my job and he started scolding me because I was unemployed. He's too set in his ways to stop. For about a month now, each of us buys his own food and we take turns at the stove. I can't go on.
Well, another one down, and as you can probably guess, Frankie Van Wie was not done with marriage. 2 years later, on August 14th of 1952, newspapers revealed that bride number 15 had already kicked Van Wie out, and that was just 9 days after their wedding. He had married 73-year-old Los Angeles widow Amelia Pritchard in a whirlwind ceremony in Las Vegas. Where else would you go? Anyway, Amelia recounted how they met.
I only met him several weeks before we were married. We met through some friends. He was a painter, painting houses, that is. He lavished his attentions on me. He took me out. I have money of my own, but he spent his own money on me.
Then came the proposal, and she accepted.
We went by bus to Las Vegas to be married. He paid the fare. He told me he had been married once before and was divorced. After our honeymoon, we moved to this Los Angeles apartment. He had picked it out for me. He was wonderful around the house. He even did the dishes. I was happy. I thought I had a wonderful man. Then today, the reporters swarmed into our apartment. I couldn't understand their interest in us. Gradually, from the questions they put to Francis, I learned of his past. I was stunned. I asked the reporters to leave. I locked the door after them, then I had it out with Francis. I asked him why he had deceived me. I ordered him out. He pleaded. He actually wept and begged me to give him a chance. He fell to his knees. But I was firm. I thought of those other women in his life. So he went.
But despite her firm stance, she admitted,
I sort of hated to throw him out the way I did. He really was such a nice man. But after all, well, I guess I'll get myself an annulment.
Complicating matters, Van Wie wasn't sure if he had divorced wife number 14, Mary Abba, before marrying Amelia. A search of Bay Area County Clerk records revealed no record of a divorce. Well, the very next night, Van Wie's stepdaughter, Dorothy Abba, that's Mary's daughter, told the police,
"My mother has never been divorced from this man. He left her to live with another woman. She talked to him by telephone several times about a divorce, but nothing happened. She finally went to the Alameda County Legal Aid Society in Oakland to find out how she could get a divorce, but she never got one."
3 days later, on Saturday, August 16th of 1952, Van Wie stepped from a plane at the Oakland Municipal Airport. A crowd applauded as he was greeted by half a dozen chorus girls. He had been signed at $500 per week, which is nearly $6,000 per week today, to star in a show titled My True Love Story at Oakland's Ray Burlesque Theater. Throughout the scripted act, Frank wore a conductor's uniform. On stage with him were 15, quote, cute, coy, and captivating pinup cuties, unquote, and they played the part of his many wives. And just what did they wear, you may wonder? Well, their outfits were described as, quote, conductor's caps and not much more, unquote. I'll let you use your imagination there. Let's just say Frank's burlesque career wasn't a long one. It was a very short one, a very, very, very short one. That Wednesday, during another act of the theater, the show was stopped. That's when Frank, his manager, and his lawyer walked on stage and announced that he would not be performing that evening. Why? Very simple. He was about to be arrested for bigamy. Not only had Frank never divorced Mary Abba to marry Amelia Pritchard, but it turns out that he had married another woman in between the two. He had wed 67-year-old Martha Moyle in Yuma, Arizona the previous year and then deserted her after 6 months of marriage. What this all means is that his latest wife Amelia wasn't wife number 15, she was really wife number 16. Frank was escorted to the Oakland City Jail and bail was set at $10,000. After a short stay there, he was transported to Los Angeles where a judge cut his bond to $3,000. For reference, that's around $35,500 today. The following month, Frank was arraigned in Superior Court and pleaded innocent and innocent by reason of insanity to the 2 counts of bigamy, but he changed his plea to guilty on October 29th of that year. The 66-year-old Van Wie was sentenced to 7 years probation, including 6 months in the county jail. But there were conditions. Upon his release, the court ordered that Van Wie must obtain approval from the probation department before marrying again. And to further prevent potential misconduct, the judge prohibited him from cohabiting with any member of the opposite sex outside of marriage. While still in prison, all 3 wives decided to end their marriages to him. One got a divorce, and the other 2 got annulments. When he was released on May 4th of 1953, Frank declared,
I've had enough of women. I'm settling down, and I'm determined to stay out of trouble.
He then took up residence in a Los Angeles hotel apartment and supported himself on his $174 World War I pension. Roughly, that's around $2,000 per month today. Van Wie was back in court on August 5th of 1955. But this time it wasn't because he was in any trouble. Instead, he wished to make sure that his marriage to his 6th wife, Mabel, the one who may have been his daughter or stepdaughter, whether that marriage was legally dissolved. He thought it had been done back in 1924, but he wasn't certain. So Judge Samuel R. Blake granted the divorce and told Frank he couldn't marry for at least 1 year. Fast forward to June 15th of 1957. That's when Mrs. June Puckett, a widow, married Van Wie in Lodi, California. The 2 then lived together on and off for 13 months before Frank left, claiming that he needed to get treatment for his asthma. After not hearing from him for 6 months, she decided to file for divorce. So on page 5 of the March 11th, 1959 edition of the Sacramento Union, there's a very small announcement in the vital statistics section. In its entirety, it reads, quote, June Van Wie versus Francis Van Wie, cruelty, unquote. Well, an observer reporter noticed that listing and decided to ask June about it. She was shocked to learn about Frank's marital history.
I had no idea. He led me to believe he had only been married once before.
Now keep in mind that Frank had violated the terms of his 7-year probation. Not only was he prohibited from remarrying without the probation department's approval, but it was also learned that he had failed to check in with them the previous month as he was required to do. Francis Van Wie was once again front page news in the California newspapers. Yet surprisingly, even with all that publicity, it took probation officers more than 3 weeks to track him down. Now, do you want to venture a guess as to who he was with at the time? If you guess with another wife, you are correct. Wife number 18 was twice widowed 81-year-old Minnie Riordan. She first met Van Wie in July 1958 at a downtown bus station. He was strolling through when he spotted Minnie struggling to lift the luggage onto a bus. Ever the gentleman, Van Wie rushed over to help. They chatted for a few minutes, and his easy charm, well, it just lit up the conversation. Frank told Minnie that he was a widower and had been divorced once. Minnie later remarked,
He never said anything about the others.
The two married on August 31st of 1958, but there was one big problem, and you know exactly what that was. Frank had never officially divorced wife number 17. When authorities asked Minnie if she'd file a complaint against him, she just shook her head.
Why, of course not. I don't have any complaints against Frank. I don't want a divorce. I don't need a divorce. Frank was the best man I ever had around the house. He had a nice disposition and no bad habits. He never drank or cursed or anything like that. He went to church every Sunday and lived a good Christian life. Why, he was baptized in the Baptist church here not long ago.
Meanwhile, back in jail, Frank commented that Minnie was
the best wife a man ever had.
On April 8th of 1959, the San Francisco Examiner ran an article titled, quote, Ding Dong Daddy tells why wedding bells rang 18 times, unquote. Now, this was supposedly penned by Frank himself, so here's an abbreviated version of what he said. Basically, I just removed some of the less significant paragraphs.
They say I've had 18 wives in my lifetime in my 72 years. Maybe, I don't know how many, I don't remember them all. I'm sorry. They call me the Ding Dong Daddy, I guess, because I had 4 wives when I worked on the D-Line trolley in San Francisco, and they live within 12 blocks of each other. I don't like that name, and I wish people wouldn't call me that. It's up to them. Most of my marriages were impulse. I was driven by impulse, and I wanted to marry them. And I always insisted on marrying them. I don't believe in living with a woman unless you're married. My troubles began when Mabel left me in 1934. We'd been married about 17 years, and I think we were happy together. She was a mind reader in a carnival, and I did jobs as painting. I'm a good painter, as good as anyone, I think. But then she started getting active in club activities and things like that, meeting a lot of people. One day she left me for some other man. I don't know who.
He then concluded,
I believe in divorce. If you're not happy, you get a divorce. But it costs sometimes $100 or $200, and so I'd just leave. And then later I'd hear that my wife divorced me, and so I married again. I always supported my wives, always paid for everything. And they never went hungry. I just shouldn't have married so many of them, I guess.
On May 1st of 1959, Van Wie was sentenced to 4 months in the Los Angeles County Jail. Then, 19 days later, June Puckett, who was his 17th wife, she was granted an annulment. And believe it or not, after this, Frank just dropped from sight. He'd never remarry again. He'd never be arrested again. He just disappeared. Which leaves us with one major question. Did Minnie wait for Frank to get out of jail? Believe it or not, she did. The couple moved to Lake Elsinore in California's Riverside County, and they stayed together until August 7th of 1963. That's when 77-year-old Francis Van Wie died of a heart attack complicated by hardening of the arteries. Minnie, his 18th wife, was by his side when he passed. Having been a World War I veteran, he was laid to rest at Fort Rosecrans National Cemetery in San Diego. Amazingly, for a man who made headlines for so many years, no one noticed his passing. That was until Lynn Ludlow, in an article she wrote for the January 5th, 1981 San Francisco Examiner, announced it to the world for the very first time. But Frank did finally get one thing right in his personal life when he said that Minnie was
the best wife a man ever had.
At least she was the best wife Francis Van Wie ever had. Useless, useful, I'll leave that for you to decide. Now, before I sign off, I just wanted to mention a few things. First, you may be wondering if anyone's ever uncovered any additional wives. And I did follow a few leads that were promising, but they were all dead ends. Either I was looking at information for the wrong Francis Van Wie, there were multiple people using that name, or some of the wives, they just went by different names, whether they're using their maiden name, their previously married name, Van Wie, or whatever. They didn't seem to jibe, but eventually I was able to make sense of them. I did mention one of these in the story, and that was his wife, Evelyn. Her real name, of course, was Brutonia Brown Crenshaw. How she got the name Evelyn, I have no clue. There was one wife, however, that I couldn't confirm one way or the other. The 1950 census lists his wife as being Blanche, but none of his 18 wives, at least that I could find, none of them went by that name. So if it ever was proven that he did marry a Blanche, she would rank as wife number 15. Second, I'd encourage you to listen to the song Ding Dong Daddy of the D-Car Line by the Cherry Poppin' Daddies, and that song came out in 1994. The lyrics, well, they're mostly factually incorrect, but it's still worth listening to. And I'll place a link to the video in both the show notes and on my website, which is uselessinformation.org. Lastly, as I've mentioned before, all the voices except mine, of course, every voice that you heard was AI generated. Yes, it's the real me, but everything else is AI generated. And the way I did it this time is I read all the quotes, recorded each one into a separate audio file, uploaded them to 11 labs, and then modified the voices. It was tough to come up with 19 different voices. Some of them didn't quite fit. In particular, I was really unhappy with the voice I chose for Van Wie. I would have loved to have someone a little bit more elderly sounding, but sadly I couldn't find anything that fit. So I just went with the voice that you heard. I should add that 2 of the audio files, they were rejected for violation of their terms. The first was of bride number 16, Amelia Pritchard. That's when she was talking about how she threw Frank out after finding out about his past. The quote was, "Why, he even threatened to commit suicide if I made him go." The second was by Frank himself, who said at the time he was in court to finalize his divorce from Mabel, quote, "I don't want to get married again. I just want to die in peace." Well, I guess any mention of the word suicide or dying in peace, that triggers the software to reject them outright. So I just decided to leave them out. You probably didn't even notice, but I will leave them in the transcript of the story, and I'll put that on my website. I'm also going to attempt to create some sort of table summarizing all of Frank's wives and their wedding dates. As I mentioned, it was a bear to confirm all these dates and get them in date order, so I'm hoping that maybe by posting it, I can save others in the future of having to do the same. And again, I'll place that with the story on my website. Just a heads up that the next episode may be delayed a little bit, and that's because I'm scheduled to give 2 useless information talks next week. One of them is at Hudson Valley Community College. I do that every semester, and I'm happy to report it's sold out again very quickly. Very happy about that. But the problem is I have little prepared at this point for those talks. I will be spending the bulk of next week working on that. So I'm going to have to put the podcast on hold for a bit. The Useless Information Podcast is part of the Airwave Media Podcast Network, so be sure to visit airwavemedia.com where you'll find a curated selection of some of the best podcasts out there. As always, thanks for listening, and take care, everyone. Bye.